Thank you. Can everyone hear me?
Yes, you sound great.
Oh, okay, great. Um, Thank you for this opportunity to present on this subject. I think it's very important. Um, and I'm just really grateful for the opportunity. The reason I chose this particular photo that you see on this PowerPoint is because if you could sum up the legislative process in a picture, this would be it. You have a lot of different people and perspectives and support, opposition, a lot of politics. It's a lot that goes on behind the scenes that makes up the legislative process, which makes up lawmaking. And what I'm going to try to do in these few slides is to make sense of this picture and basically try to make some sense of the legislative process and do my best to answer any questions that you may have. But if I can't answer a question, I'm going to be honest with you. I'm going to tell you that I can't answer that question right now, but I will provide my contact information and I will do my best to provide you with the answers to the questions you may have if I can't answer them at this time. So to begin, the process begins with an idea. And oftentimes we have ideas about laws and policies that we may or may not agree with, or we would like to see implemented or changed. And once we have an idea, what we want to do is to begin to, one, research that idea, research whatever laws or policies that are in place right now to address this particular issue, or maybe there is an absence of legislation that doesn't address the issue that we are concerned about. We want to identify other people who might feel the same as we do, and build a base of constituency base of supporters. We also might want to look at who might be opposed to our idea and see if we can engage those folks as well and possibly meet in the middle. It's a lot of work that goes into this process, but it's not impossible. It just takes time and commitment. You probably want to write out whatever it is that you want to address. So for example, I'll use something practical. For example, this year, one of the things that we wanted to do was to automate the expungement process. The expungement process is a very, very lengthy process. It can be very cumbersome and challenging to those folks who are seeking expungements. It can, in some cases, cost a lot of money and take up a lot of time. And so by that, I mean that people have to pay court costs and possibly pay an attorney, take time off of work, possibly, to go to court and maybe have a number of appearances. They may have to get pay for their live scan. It's just a very cumbersome process. And so what we wanted to do was we wanted to identify the folks who in the current law were eligible for expungement. If you've met the criteria to be eligible for expungement, then what we wanted to do was automate the process. So we wanted to take the individual out and not have them go through the process of requesting an expungement and just turn it over basically to the DOJ and say, if these individuals meet all of the requirements under the current law, then we will automate their records and provide them with an expungement. needless to say, that was easier said than done. And it was a learning experience, I'll say, to go through this process and find out how people felt about automating the expungement process. So after you have your bill idea, you want to identify a bill author. A bill author is someone who will author your legislation and champion your legislation. So this is someone either in the Assembly or the Senate who will take your legislation on and carry it through both houses to the end. And you have to find someone who has some working knowledge of the area that you're in. So for example, with the example I used with regard to the expungement process, automating the expungement process, we had to find someone who had working knowledge of public safety issues and would be a champion for that issue and has been a champion of those issues before. And with that, you identify an author, you talk to that person, you find out if this is something they want to do. You engage with their staff more than likely, and you provide them with the bill information. And they will read over that, study that, and you will have a number of conversations with them. What you will become is a co-sponsor. And so the legislator will be the author, and you will be the sponsor of the bill. Once that bill is accepted by the author, the bill will be submitted to the Leg Council, who will review the language and then turn it over to the Rules Committee. Now, the Rules Committee will look over the legislation and make sure everything is looks right, and then they will assign that proposed legislation to a committee. And so, for example, in the example that I'm using, our legislation was assigned to the Public Safety Committee. And so from there, the Public Safety Committee has the opportunity to review the legislation to see if this is something that we can do in California, something that we want to do in California, whether it's legal, and all of the different considerations that one must take up. After the committee reviews the legislation, they will make a vote as to whether or not the bill will pass out of that particular committee. And possibly what will happen is they might provide some amendments or make some amendments to the bill. And one thing that I think is very important for folks to understand is that if you have a bill idea that you submit to a member of the state legislature, it is not going to look the same when it goes through the legislative process, because as it moves through the process, each and every committee in both houses will more than likely make amendments to your proposed legislation. And that is something that you have to be prepared for. And when you're working on this legislation, you have to be prepared to negotiate with different stakeholders, with people who might be opposed to your legislation, and maybe not the policy itself, but maybe pieces and parts of it. And so as a result, you have to be willing to sit down with folks who may not totally agree with you to come to an understanding of what would make what would make the most sense and what would make this legislation amenable to all parties involved. And so as a result, you sit down and you talk with those folks, and this is an ongoing process all the way to the end. You're going to have to sit and talk with other folks who might agree with you, might not agree with you, might feel as though your bill is not strong enough, and maybe they want to add some things, maybe they want to take some things away, and you have to be willing to go through those negotiations. And so the committee will make a recommendation. They will vote as a committee as to whether or not the bill will come out of that committee. And if they vote favorably, your bill would move on. If they do not vote favorably, if the bill does not pass, then your bill will be held in committee. If the bill is passed and possibly passed with amendments, then it will go to the second reading. Each house has 3 readings. The first reading, which is an introduction of the bill. The second reading, which is to introduce the bill again a second time and to go over any amendments to the bill. If you have a bill that requires funding for some particular reason or has a financial component. So for example, in the example that I gave in terms of automating the expungement process would require work for the DOJ, which would require financing. And that would have to go through Senate and Assembly appropriations. And in many cases, this is where a lot of bills die, because oftentimes we have ideas about legislation and we don't consider that a cost is attached to that, how much that cost is, and where the money will come from. And it is the responsibility of the appropriations committees to review all legislation, particularly those pieces of legislation that have cost attached. What is the impact on our state budget? Is this something that we can do? And is this something we should do? And so as a result, the Committee on Appropriations will make some amendments to your bill as well. And that happens if you're lucky, because in many cases, bills are held in appropriations in the first house of origin. And so if a bill comes before Senate appropriations or Assembly appropriations, and either house doesn't determine that bill is a necessary public expenditure, then that bill might not pass out of committee and will be held. If you're fortunate enough to have your bill passed out of appropriations with amendments, as I stated before, one thing is sure, your bill might not look the same as it did when you initially introduced it, but you will still have a working bill nonetheless. Once your bill is passed out of appropriations, it goes before the full House for the third reading. And the third reading of the bill again reads over the legislation, make sure any amendments are consistent with what came out of the previous committee, and the full House will vote. So if it starts in the Assembly, the full assembly will vote as to whether or not that bill will move on to the next house. So theoretically, you could come up with a bill idea, have it introduced, make it through the policy committee, make it through appropriations, accept all the amendments, work with all the folks in opposition, or maybe you might not have any opposition. And yet, when it comes to the vote of the full House, you don't have the requisite votes and it doesn't make it out of the House. If you do get the requisite votes to make it out of the Assembly or the Senate, then the bill will be moved on to the next House. And so what you will have is the first reading in the next House, and that bill will be read so that everyone in this House understands what this bill intends to do in its current version. Next, the bill will be passed on to the Rules Committee to assign the bill to a particular policy committee. And so the bill that I use as an example would again be passed on to the Senate Public Safety Committee for them to review and to possibly offer amendments or possibly reject. And what happens in the next House is the process repeats itself. And so everything that took place in the previous House will take place in the next House. All of the processes are consistent. And so once that happens, you go through the policy committee, you accept amendments, there are negotiations, there are time periods between moving from one subcommittee to the next. But those are opportunities for you to amend your bill, to offer amendments to the Public Safety Committee, or offer amendments to appropriations, so that you can keep your bill moving, hopefully moving through the process. Oh, if you're fortunate enough to have your bill pass out of the second House with amendments, that bill has to go back to the previous House. And that has to happen because in the previous House, for example, let's say the Assembly, the author presented a particular bill. And when it was in the Assembly, it moved through that process and it was either amended or not. In either case, once it goes on to the second House, then those members in the second House have the opportunity to offer up amendments as well. And so what has to happen is once that process takes place, it has to go back to the original House of origin for a concurrence vote. And a concurrence vote is basically a vote saying that we concur with, or we agree with, we can accept the amendments that were made in the previous House. And a vote of that full House has to be made to accept those amendments. And if you receive a favorable vote in the full House on the amendments that were made in the previous House, then your bill will move on to the governor's desk for signature. And of course, there are a couple of things that can happen in that process. Your bill can be signed by the governor. Your bill can become law without a signature. If the governor decides not to sign it, he has a time frame with which to sign the bill. I believe it's 12 days once it reaches his desk. However, if the governor receives a bill at the end of the legislative session, but the same year as a legislative period, the governor then has 30 days with which to review that bill and to sign it or not. Or he can veto a bill. And then the bill will either be vetoed or the legislature has the opportunity to decide within 60 days to override the veto with 2/3 votes in each house. And so that is the legislative process in a nutshell. However, there's a lot that goes into that of course I didn't get the opportunity to speak upon, but I'm happy to take any questions at this point to kind of fill in any gaps that might have been there.
Thank you so much. That was so helpful to sort of get the flow chart of the process that a bill will potentially go through. I have 2 questions that have come in already, but for those who are online, please feel free to start asking additional questions that you have. It could be directly related to this particular process or anything else that has to do with any sort of legislative process, whether it's working with a local legislator or trying to get buy-in from a community-based organization, sort of whatever questions you have, we have plenty of time to address them. So the first question someone asked is how do you find and choose a bill author in particular?
I think the best way to find and choose a bill author is to whatever author you're considering, look at their past record and see what bills they have carried in the past. And if they have carried bills that are similar or consistent with what it is you're trying to introduce, that would be a starting point. You could also look at, depending upon what the issue is, how does that issue impact the people that your author represents? So if the people, the constituents of that particular author are directly impacted by your legislation or your proposed idea, then that is something that you would want to bring to the author's attention. We also have to look at sometimes political issues and nuances, such as the author's success with moving legislation through the process, the author's influence within the state legislature. How long has that author been in the state legislature, whether this individual is about to be termed out or not and is considered a lame duck. All these things you have to consider, because these are all of the variables that will affect the success or failure of your legislation. Identifying an author is not a random process. When you identify an author, they have to be a champion for you. They have to believe in what it is that you are trying to do. And they have to be a strong advocate for you and your legislation. And in some respects, they have to follow your lead. And what do I mean by that? You don't want an author who would take your legislation and make it their own and not recognize whatever concerns or perspectives that you bring to the table, that you and your constituency bring to the table. Because when amendments are inevitably made to your bill, You want an author that's going to fight for what you have currently in your bill and not easily give up things within the bill because just for the sake of moving it through the process. And so you want an author that will fight for you, that will listen to you, that will say that, you know, on these issues here, we're not willing to negotiate because this impacts people's lives. But on this particular piece here, if we have to take that out, as long as we still maintain the integrity of the bill, then we're willing to sacrifice that to move the bill forward. You have to have an author that stands with you on those issues.
That's really helpful to keep in mind, things like the length of when and where someone is and how long they're serving. But then additionally, like looking at their history. Is there an easy online resource where people can look up the history of how someone has voted in the past?
I think you have to look at a couple places. You have to look at the author's page, webpage. You have to look at the legislative, and I'm blanking on the name of the website, and I'm on it all day, every day. But this is the page that you go to look up legislation, and you will see the entire history of that legislation. And you can find out exactly how each member voted on these pieces of legislation. And I think that is the most helpful piece of information, is being able to put in a particular bill and see the life cycle of that bill and see how folks voted throughout the process. But before we complete the webinar, I'll try to give everyone that website.
Great, thank you. I have two other questions that have come in. The first is, what is the best way to make sure that my bill doesn't die in appropriations?
Very, very, very good question, but a very, very complicated question because none of us want our bills to die in appropriations. And so what happens initially is once you make it through your policy committee and you make it to appropriations, you're going to encounter someone who is the consultant for appropriations. And this individual is basically the gatekeeper for appropriations. And what they do is they review legislation, and they will decide whether or not this is something that is fiscally responsible, whether this is good policy, and if, in light of all of those things, whether the state just does or does not have the money to do this in their estimation. And that individual is going to make a recommendation to the chair and ultimately the entire appropriations committee. And their recommendations are public, and you can read their recommendations, and they will be on a number of different issues. So what you want to do is you want to sit down with that individual, if possible, and see what amendments they might want you to make. If there's opposition to the bill, you'll want to meet with those folks as well to decide upon amendments to the bill. And in appropriations, basically, amendments are designed to decrease the cost of the bill. And so to your question, what do I do to get my bill through appropriations? To make your bill as least as inexpensive as possible. the more expensive your bill is, particularly if you don't have a mechanism with which to pay for it, and there is not a willingness on behalf of the budget committee to say, okay, this is something that we think is important, or the governor hasn't allocated any resources for this particular issue, you have to cut the cost of that bill as best you possibly can. And that's, in a nutshell, that's what you have to do. If you want your bill to get through appropriations, you have to trim the costs. And so you might have a bill that is a really good bill with that might do a number of different things and some really good ideas. But if those ideas have a price tag, then you're going to have to trim some of that away to come out on the other side with a very lean bill, but most importantly, still a very substantive bill.
That's such a helpful point to keep in mind about the way that cost operates when a bill is in appropriations. So thank you. I have one final question that's come in. And so if you're sort of thinking through a question right now, go ahead and send it to us. But the final question I have is like, what do I do if a legislator reaches out to me? I don't have any bills right now, like any ideas for bills right now, but I might have an idea later. So I think this is not an uncommon situation for our colleges or for some of the folks who are doing the work with the college programming, is that, you know, a legislator's office will get in contact with them. And even if they don't have a bill idea at that current moment, how do you recommend best navigating that situation?
If a legislator reaches out to you, it's actually a good thing, because they respect you, they respect your work, and they obviously want to work with you in some capacity. I would recommend meeting with the legislator or their staffer who might have some ideas for a bill. Typically, they have ideas, things that they want to do. And when they reach out to groups or organizations, they're looking for co-sponsors or sponsors who typically operate in that particular space. So they might not say that, you know what, we want to do a bill on reforming probation, for example. But they might reach out to a particular group that they think has knowledge in that space, that's an expert in that space. And then you would meet with them, and maybe you didn't have an idea for a bill, but they do. And you can help them craft that piece of legislation. You provide them with knowledge and insight that that member might not have. Although these folks are very knowledgeable individuals, they might be passionate about subject matter areas, their knowledge might not run as deep as yours, because maybe you're focused on a particular issue in your work. And so you have a lot of knowledge in that area. They will want to partner with you to create a piece of legislation that they would want to submit in the next session, the next year. And so I think it's a good idea to meet with them and have a conversation and see where they are and what ideas they have on the table. And if they have some ideas that align with your work and what you do and something that you can get behind, then I think it's a great opportunity to work with that particular legislator to see if you can advance those bills in the next session.
That's really helpful advice. Thank you so much. No other questions have come in, so I think we'll just go ahead and let folks enjoy the rest of their Fridays. Ed, thank you so much for walking us through this. I've been recording the webinar, and I will post it online, send the link out to everyone involved. And if you have questions that come up after the fact, you can feel free to reach out to us. But just a huge thank you, Ed, for walking us through this. This has been enormously informative and helpful, and it answers a lot of questions that actually we get or come up throughout this work. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
All right. Bye, everyone.
Bye.